In the last video, I made the case that the troll and SJW were united in their desire to detach themselves and everybody else from their identities. And I connected that desire to the nature of online life, which dissociates you from your personal identity without you necessarily even realizing it. Now in this video, I want to take a step back and look at the birth of these two figures. For it's my contention that the SJW and troll share a common parent, and that common parent is none other than the hipster. And that's who we're going to look at today. Now what we find in the hipster is someone who's dealing with the same problems we've been talking about, namely with the bulldozing of individuality and personal identity in modern society. Here's an old meme to get us started. These two young men seem to feel pressured to exaggerate their straightness by sitting far apart in a hot tub. And it's funny because it suggests they are insecure in their identity as straight men. It shows them to some degree as the opposite of what they are trying to present. Now this insecurity about identity is pervasive in the modern world. For as your sense of who you are as an individual diminishes, as your identity weakens, because you don't have any opportunity to exercise your personal will, you become extremely concerned with how you are viewed by others. For the simple reason that how you are viewed by others increasingly becomes how you view yourself. The boundary between inside and outside begins to melt away, and you find yourself requiring constant validation and affirmation of your identity by others, in order to feel that you have one at all. Now, the descent into this condition has been documented in great detail by the writings of the literary god and forefather of the hipsters, David Foster Wallace. My whole life, begins one of his stories, I've been a fraud. I'm not exaggerating. Pretty much all I've ever done all the time is try to create a certain impression of me and other people. Now, what Wallace is describing here is this tendency to always look at yourself from the outside, through the eyes of others, and thus through the lens of group stereotypes and norms and assumptions. As his own narrator states later, my own basic problem was that at an early age I'd somehow chosen to cast my lot with my life's drama's supposed audience instead of with the drama itself. In such a condition you have no fixed identity, but rather a protean and mutable self which changes according to situation and audience. It is social identity gaining the upper hand over personal identity, just as we've been talking about in past videos. And as soon as this condition sets in, it perpetuates and intensifies itself in a vicious circle that Wallace called the fraudulence paradox. The fraudulence paradox was that the more time and effort you put into trying to appear impressive or attractive to other people, the less impressive or attractive you felt inside. You were a fraud. And the more of a fraud you felt like, the harder you tried to convey an impressive or likable image of yourself so that other people wouldn't find out what a hollow, fraudulent person you really were. The only way to escape this paradox, according to Wallace, is to push its logic all the way until you identify so completely with the other's impressions of you and with the other itself that there's no you left to feel like a fraud. You finally become, in other words, anonymous, and thus just free to be whatever social identity or mask you're wearing at the time. This beatific state is described by Wallace like this. What if all the infinitely dense and shifting worlds of stuff inside you, every moment of your life, turned out now to be somehow fully open and expressible afterward, after what you think of as you has died? And it was this, the way of self-detachment and self-negation, that Wallace practiced and recommended. It's why his fiction, like so much postmodern art, is always trying to detach you from the world of the artwork, always negating itself, and by extension making you participate in that self-negation, until at last you are led to realize there was never any real self or identity to begin with. You become anonymous. And that brings us to the hipsters. For the hipsters were the expression on the social and popular plane of Wallace's work in literature. Clearly, they identified with their social masks and costumes, their consumer lifestyles and tastes, more than anybody ever had before. But at the same time, they constantly negated those identities, and in so doing detached themselves even further from their own personal identities. In other words, they pursued the solution to the fraudulence paradox laid out by Wallace completely. Take, for instance, the hipster's penchant for PBR. Now, before there was an infinite variety of craft beer through which people could explore and express their identities, there was PBR. And the point in drinking PBR, as a hipster, was to pretend that it was good, even high class, even though it clearly wasn't. It was cheap and bad and unpopular. But by adopting this ironic posture, the hipster could identify with the product while signaling that he didn't identify with it. And because he saw himself now more from the outside than from the inside, he was able in this way to identify with his social mask or costume while at the same time negating his personal attachment to that identity. And now we can begin to see, I think, how the hipster was really the ultimate consumer. As one writer put it, there was something unreconciled, if not schizophrenic, in the hipster outlook, which both venerated personal authenticity and assumed unlimited freedom for individuals to construct new identities through their tastes and consumer choices. It was as if the hipster was so enthralled to the social identities attached to commercial products and lifestyles that he demanded an ever greater variety of products with which to identify, in total freedom to remake himself upon the slightest whim, and in cultivating a habit of constant self-detachment and self-negation. By coating everything in a protective layer of irony, he ensured he never truly sacrificed his unlimited freedom to put on and take off any identity he wished. He became, in other words, anonymous, which is why he couldn't stand to be labeled, couldn't bear to be called what he so obviously was. Because, as it soon became clear, the hipster's attempts to escape the fraudulence paradox were a failure. Behind all the irony and all the self-negation and self-detachment remained a self. And even though his costume winked at you and said, "This is not a costume," it was still a costume, a facade, hiding an all-too-human face behind it. And so the hipster was mocked and ridiculed for his hypocrisy and driven off the center stage of the social scene, not least by other hipsters. But by then he had already served his purpose. He helped lead us into a new world and a new marketplace of seemingly infinite variety, where everything was transformed into both a prop for a never-ending social performance and the very source of people's identity. We live today in a hipster's paradise. And if it doesn't seem like a paradise, if it seems more like the opposite, perhaps the solution employed by the hipsters to the problem of the loss of personal identity in the modern world was not really a solution. Perhaps it just made the problem worse. And there is some indication that David Wallace realized this near the end of his life, and that his last novel was to some degree an attempt to work out a new solution to the problem. But David Wallace never lived to finish it, and the hipsters didn't get the memo. In fact, they soon re-emerged in a new form, setting aside their quirkiness and playfulness, which was always a little too theatrical to be believed. The new hipster was all fire and brimstone and ashes, and he arrived to finish what he started. At last he would throw off the chains of personal identity forever. At last he would be free to be whatever he wanted to be, as advertising and the marketplace had always promised. At last, anonymity would save him from his own pitiful self. And thus, the SJW and the Troll were born. And in the next video of this series, I will examine their renewed assault on personal identity in detail.